Hello everyone. Thank you for attending today's REL Mid-Atlantic webinar. Before we begin, we want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the maximize icon at the top right of the widget or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. Additional materials, including a copy of today's slide deck, are available in the Resource List widget, indicated by the green file icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the purple Q&A widget at the bottom to submit your question. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait to the end for the Q&A session. If you have technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget as a question mark icon that covers most common technical issues. You can also submit technical issues via the Q&A widget. Please note, most technical issues can be resolved by pressing F5 or Command R on Macs to refresh the player console. At the end of the webinar, please provide feedback using the survey widget at the bottom of your screen. Finally, an on-demand version of this webcast is available approximately 1 day after the webcast using the same audience link sent to you to access today's event. A full 508 compliant version of today's webcast will be available from the REL Mid-Atlantic website in approximately 2 weeks. Now I'd like to introduce Brian Gill, the Project Director for the REL Mid-Atlantic. Brian, you now have the floor.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. As you just heard, I'm Brian Gill, and I direct the Mid-Atlantic Regional Educational Laboratory. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today to talk about using feedback from teachers in the evaluation of principals. So let's start with a quick agenda for the day. And we can move to the next slide that'll show that. So I'll give you a quick overview of what REL Mid-Atlantic is, and then we're going to have a brief audience poll so that we know who we're talking with. I'm going to talk about measuring school leaders' performance, and in particular the use of 360-degree evaluations to meet school district aims in leader evaluation. We'll talk about some examples of some existing survey instruments that are designed for that purpose, for gathering teacher feedback used in school leader evaluation. And then we'll hear more specifically about the experience of the Pittsburgh Public Schools, which has been working on the possibility of introducing these kinds of surveys. And finally, we hope to have some time at the end, as you just heard, for some questions and answers, which you can submit online at any point during the presentation. I have two presenters who are joining me today. Alyssa Ford-Heywood is the Director of Performance Management with the Pittsburgh Public Schools, and she'll talk about the work they are doing there. And Brittney Gionfriddo is an analyst on the staff of REL Mid-Atlantic. So let's say a little bit about what the REL is first. That'll be on the next slide. REL Mid-Atlantic is one of 10 regional educational laboratories across the United States, all of which are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, which is an independent, nonpartisan research agency within the U.S. Department of Education. REL Mid-Atlantic, in particular, works with state and local educators and policymakers in Delaware, D.C., Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, with the aim of building their capacity to interpret and use data and research to address their education challenges. Each REL's work is driven by the needs that states and local agencies in its region have, and we provide support in three general ways. One is by conducting applied research studies to gather new evidence. A second is by providing training and coaching around the use of research or data. And the third is by disseminating existing research knowledge. Our dissemination work, for example this webinar, is often relevant beyond the region, and that's why we make it available to educators and policymakers across the country. So that's about the REL. Go to the next slide. And to that end, we hope that you'll share this information with those in your networks who might have need for it. So in particular, REL Mid-Atlantic is on Twitter, and our Twitter handle is @REL Mid-Atlantic, as you might guess. So that's enough for the background. Let's go on to the next slide where we'll start to talk about the substance of today's talk. And first, I want to talk about why measures of principal performance matter. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. First, I want to do the audience survey and get a sense of who we're talking with. So all of you should have this up on your screens, just asking what your role is. Are you a principal or a teacher or a district central office staff, or do you have one of these other roles that we have in mind? So please go ahead and take a minute to check the appropriate box on your screen and submit your reply. And then we'll turn to the substance. Okay, so if we have enough, I will wait until my colleagues who are checking this out can see if we've got responses from folks, and then they will, I believe, put them up for us. Or maybe not yet. We'll check into that later. Here we go. I think. Forgive us, it looks like the slides are bouncing around a little bit. Well, thanks for that. So we've got some sense. It looks like people are all over the place. We've got a whole bunch in the other category. So if you want to submit through the Q&A link and tell us what sort of role you've got so we get a better sense of who all those others are, that would be great. We can at least monitor that for later work. In any case, thank you all for joining us. All right. Let's go now and talk about why measures of principal performance matter. So principals, as you probably know, are the second most important school-based factor in affecting student outcomes, just after teachers. They matter a lot, and they vary in effectiveness, just like teachers do, just like other professionals do. So it's important to be able to assess that variation. More specifically, having good evaluation measures can help provide principals with actionable feedback to help them improve their performance. And more generally, can also lead districts and states and researchers to help identify and possibly replicate best practices as they are conducted by the most effective school leaders in the district. So that said, as we turn to the next slide, the challenge is it's hard to measure principal performance. It's important, but it's difficult. And that's because school leaders' jobs are complex and multidimensional. Principals do lots of different things every day in their schools. It's not straightforward for a superintendent or whoever is supervising a principal to come into a school and observe for an hour in the way that a principal might observe a classroom teacher and get a very good sense of what the principal is doing all the rest of the day, right? Because it varies so much. So those who are supervising principals typically can observe only a small part of everything that principals do. So it's a little difficult for them to do the evaluation. It's also difficult to measure a principal's effect on students. Even though there's good research showing that in general, principals have large effects on students, it is nonetheless difficult to measure the effect of any individual principal on students, and that's because their effects are indirect. They're not directly teaching. They affect students by helping improve teaching in their school, but that is not direct, and that makes it harder to measure. And in fact, I regret to say that nobody has yet found a reliable and valid statistical approach to measure the effect of individual principals on student outcomes. We've tried, believe me. It's very hard. So you put all these things together, and the result is the existing measures of principal performance aren't that good. They're not great at distinguishing the principals who are really high performing from those who need to improve. And that's why finding another lens on principal performance is especially important. Now, teachers can provide that lens. They have a unique perspective. They see principals on a daily basis. They directly experience principals' leadership practices. And so they provide the opportunity to produce another measure that can be one of multiple measures for school leaders. Bottom line is that to provide evaluation measures that are useful, the systems have to be objective, fair, applicable to a wide range of leadership styles, and capable of differentiating between effective and ineffective school leaders. And using teacher input as one component of such a system can help promote those aims and improve principal evaluations. So let's turn to the next slide and talk about how this kind of performance evaluation is used in other fields. Because incorporating teacher feedback in principal evaluations would be a way to follow the example of what are often called 360-degree evaluations that are common in other sectors of the economy. And 360 evaluations are known by lots of different names. Sometimes they're called multi-rater feedback, multi-source assessment, group performance review, all-around feedback. The general idea is that they incorporate a variety of sources of information. So you're not evaluated just based on the judgment of your boss, in essence. But a 360 evaluation is one that might include feedback not only from a boss, but also some subordinates, also colleagues, also in some instances customers. They are often used in business. They're increasingly used in healthcare, for example, where doctors might have evaluations in some circumstances that include feedback from their colleagues, from nurses who work with them, from patients that they serve. And of course, there are examples of 360 evaluations used in education, specifically in teaching. There is a long tradition of professors in higher education being evaluated in part by the students rating their teaching and their coursework. And more recently, in the last decade or so, that sort of thing has become increasingly common in K-12 schooling as well, using student feedback to provide input on teachers. There is now very good evidence that with appropriate survey instruments, that students can provide useful input on their teachers that's correlated with their effect on student outcomes. And surely if students in kids can provide useful input on their teachers' performance, then it seems likely that teachers would be able to provide useful input on their principals. How might that be useful? Let's go to the next slide and talk about how this kind of feedback could be useful for improvement, specifically for school leaders in getting feedback from teachers. First of all, the kind of input teachers can provide through surveys could include formative feedback on specific domains and dimensions of leadership that could help a principal improve practice. Second, there is evidence that teacher feedback on principals is in fact related to student achievement growth in the school, suggesting that it's aligned with ultimate aims of improving student outcomes. And then finally, there is some recent evidence from a big Department of Education funded study that when teacher feedback is included as part of a comprehensive evaluation system for both teachers and principals, that various positive outcomes can result. First of all, the results of the evaluation are viewed as objective by principals. In addition, there's evidence that it improved their instructional leadership. It also provided improvements in the trust between teachers and principals, interestingly, which is surely an important element of a high-performing school. And then finally, there's even some evidence that that doing this can lead to improved student achievement outcomes in math. So given all of these potential benefits of using teacher feedback in principal evaluation, perhaps it isn't surprising that a joint committee that was established by the National Associations of Elementary and Secondary School Principals not long ago suggested that teacher surveys would be one useful way for measuring key domains of principal leadership and providing 360-style feedback. So let's turn to the next slide and talk a little bit about different ways this might be done, because it's important to acknowledge that there's more than one way to incorporate teacher feedback into principal evaluations. So one way, of course, that's probably familiar to folks who are teachers is that teacher surveys could be formally included in a mathematical formula that determines a principal's overall rating on multiple measures. That's one possibility. But another possibility, of course, is that they could be informally included as evidence to inform a supervisor's rating of the principal's practice. That is, a supervisor might use the information from the teacher surveys to make a professional judgment about principal practice. Either way, it's important to make sure that the survey elements align with school leadership domains. Most, maybe all states have frameworks for school leadership and evaluation, and fortunately there is a lot of consistency across those, and in fact many of the existing survey instruments for teacher evaluation are designed to incorporate some of those elements. But for any particular school district considering using this, it would be worth examining whether and to what extent the domains in the survey instrument are consistent with the domains of professional practice that you want to encourage in your school leaders. So in a few minutes, Brittney's going to talk about more specifically about a few existing surveys that are used this way. Before we get to that, though, let's turn to the next slide and talk a little bit about some concerns and challenges related to using teacher feedback in the evaluation of principals. One, of course, is anonymity of the respondents. Anonymity is a foundational component of 360-degree feedback in general, not just in education. And all of the surveys that we talk about during this presentation are designed to deliver anonymous data that's summarized at the aggregate level to make sure that teachers can give honest responses and not be concerned that they'll be identified individually. Bias is another potential concern of principals, and one that we've heard sometimes when talking with them. And in particular, principals might worry that teacher surveys could become popularity contests, right? And this would be a problem if there are some things that principals need to do that are best for the long-term success of a school and its students, but that aren't necessarily popular with teachers, or at least not with all the teachers. This could be a particular concern in a chronically low-performing school that a principal has been sent in and asked to turn around and may need to do things that are not popular with all the teachers. Now, fortunately, the surveys we're talking about are designed to avoid turning an evaluation into a popularity contest. But even so, the possibility that they could be used for a kind of unfair retaliation against an unpopular principal is something that the superintendents and principal supervisors should keep in mind. And frankly, that might be a good reason in some circumstances at least to use the teacher feedback as informal feedback for an evaluation rating that a superintendent or a supervisor would give, rather than making them a mechanical percentage of an evaluation score. Then finally, it's just worth noting that getting buy-in is important. and it's important in part to be able to address up front some of these challenges and legitimate concerns that principals might have. So it should involve engaging stakeholders so that everyone involved is aware of what a 360 feedback process is about, what it's intended to do, how it's going to be used. Stakeholders at the table could include not only principals and their supervisors, but other central office staff, union representatives, and teacher representatives as well. And in a few minutes, Dr. Ford-Heywood is going to talk a bit about what that process of engagement is involving in Pittsburgh. When we get to the Q&A, we'll be interested in hearing from you about whether there are any other potential implementation challenges or worries that you are concerned about. And that's the end of my section. So now I want to turn it over to Brittney Gionfriddo, who's going to talk about some examples of specific survey instruments that have been designed for teachers to give feedback on principal performance. So we'll turn to the next slide and turn it over to Brittney.
Thank you, Brian. As Brian noted earlier, a teacher survey is a useful way to incorporate teacher feedback into a principal evaluation system. Most of the teacher survey instruments that have been used to gather teacher feedback for the purpose of assessing principals' performance really are quite new, and very few of them have been assessed for reliability or validity, which means they could be considered to still be in the pilot phase. Some states, such as Minnesota and Massachusetts, have developed their own teacher survey for the purposes of informing principal performance. However, those instruments are in that camp of those that have not been rigorously evaluated. The next slides that we're going to talk about today highlight two instruments that have been evaluated, the VALED and the Tripod Teacher Survey. And we just want to note that the REL cannot officially endorse any of these instruments, but we can provide information on them, which is our goal for today. Next slide, please. Thank you. The Vanderbilt Assessment for Leadership in Education, known as the VALED, focuses on measuring school leadership behaviors that influence teacher performance and student learning. The respondents of the instrument include teachers, the principal, and the principal supervisor, which mimics that 360-degree evaluation method that Brian spoke to earlier. The instrument is designed to have all teachers in a school complete the survey. As Brian noted earlier in the presentation, responses are kept anonymous by providing data at the aggregate level. The VALED is currently being used by many districts across the country, including Baltimore, Maryland, Cleveland, Ohio, Des Moines, Long Beach, California, Hillsborough County, Florida, Broward County, Florida, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. Specifically, the VALED encompasses 6 core components and 6 key processes, which are highlighted on the screen right now. Within the frame of the VALED, core components are characteristics of schools that support the learning of students and enhance the ability of teachers to teach. Key processes refer to how leaders create and manage those core components. The idea is that key processes create core components. The output of the assessment includes an overall effectiveness score and effectiveness scores in the cross-section of each of the 6 core components and 6 key processes, as well as suggested areas of improvement to guide principal practice. The scores are calculated using equally weighted responses of all respondents, the principal, teachers, and the principal supervisor. And the output also interestingly provides data showing variability among those 3 respondent categories. Next slide, please. The VALED has been evaluated and has more supporting evidence than other instruments. Specifically, the Garrett study, a recent 2-year study of the VALED that implemented the instrument in 8 districts across the United States, found that the VALED produced scores distributed across the entire range of possible performance categories, an improvement over many current evaluation systems. That same study also noted that 75% of principal participants reported that feedback from the VALED instrument was more objective and useful than feedback provided by the previously existing evaluation system, which did not incorporate a teacher survey. In addition, the Garrett study found that implementing the VAL-ED alongside a teacher evaluation and feedback system produced significant improvements in instructional leadership practices and teacher-principal trust, which Brian spoke to earlier. The Porter study found the VAL-ED to be a reliable instrument for measuring principal performance. The instrument operated similarly across schools with different characteristics, including elementary, middle, and high schools. Additionally, the 2014 Kobe Minor study found that the instrument was reliable in differentiating principal effectiveness 70% of the time when compared to district leadership's perceptions of their best and lowest performing principals. So there was an alignment there. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so on to the next, the second of the two instruments we'll be discussing today, the Tripod Teacher Survey. The Tripod Teacher Survey is another instrument with a fair amount of supportive evidence. The goal of the instrument is to provide feedback to inform school improvement efforts. The Tripod Teacher Survey is meant to only be completed by teachers within the principal's school. Based on their own internal research, Tripod Education Partners notes the survey measures as reliable, but as a function of the number of teachers surveyed. They highly recommend surveying the entire teacher population of each school. To form the measures of their teacher survey, Tripod conducted a literature review focused on school, principal, and teacher effectiveness. The 6 measures are based on peer-reviewed research linking each measure to student outcomes. Those 6 measures that are incorporated into the Tripod Teacher Survey are on the screen right now. While most of the measures listed are self-explanatory, I felt like it was worth noting that Tripod defines school-wide academic press as the extent to which a school sets high standards for instructional quality and teachers collaborate to meet those standards. The scores are the result of an equally weighted average of all teacher responses, and as noted before, this creates anonymity for respondents. A unique component of the Tripod Teacher Survey is that it asks teachers which actors and experiences were most influential on their development. This information is intended for informal use to gain insight regarding the contributions of different staff members and district or school supports. So it can help really provide some insight to district staff as well regarding where teachers are getting this information from. Some of the actors that people could say and helped provide some of this information is the principal, teaching coaches, regarding experience, school-based professional development, things like that. Next slide, please. A 2014 REL Midwest study focused on whether incorporating the Tripod Teacher Survey into an existing principal evaluation model improved the model's ability to explain variation in schools' average value-added achievement gains. And what they found was that 2 measures specifically, school leadership and cultural press for excellence falls underneath the school-wide academic press component or measure, that those 2 measures specifically did correlate with school value-added scores. The measures showed a statistically significant positive relationship with school-level achievement growth and improved the link between the principal evaluation ratings and the school's achievement growth in their math reading composite scores. And that wraps up our discussion of existing survey instruments. And with that, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Alyssa Ford-Heywood, who, with Pittsburgh Public Schools, who is going to provide the district perspective of introducing these surveys.
Thank you so much, Brittney. If we could move to, thank you. So I've been asked to talk about Pittsburgh's experience as we consider implementing a stakeholder engagement tool or a 360 survey. Pittsburgh had been implementing evaluation systems for school leaders since 2007. And you can imagine over the years of implementing these programs, we had begun to see some trends for our educators. Specifically, one of the trends we were seeing amongst our school leaders were high percentages of principals and assistant principals who were being evaluated at the highest levels of performance. And as you can see on the slide, in 2017, during this year, almost 98% of our school leaders were rated at the highest levels of performance. And for us, that was distinguished and proficient practice. And you can imagine that would not present an ability to really distinguish our principals because we saw this clumping at the highest levels. In contrast, what we were seeing with our student achievement outcomes is that a large percentage of our students were performing at lower levels of performance. And in that same year for students in grades 6 through 8, 76% of them were not able to achieve grade level in math. So we were seeing a real high disparity between our school leaders' performance and our student performance. The next slide, please. This left us wondering about whether the rating systems that we were implementing were producing the most accurate results and giving us information about our school leaders' practice that would allow us to provide the support that they needed. When our district learned about the possibility of incorporating a 360 survey tool and believing that this tool could possibly help us in driving towards more accurate results for our school leaders, we were interested in exploring about whether or not that made sense for our district. In addition to accuracy in results, we also hope that incorporating this tool could create more alignment across our evaluation systems. Currently, we are using a survey or stakeholder survey for our teachers where students are providing information about teacher practices. And so by including a stakeholder survey for other role groups, we thought we would be able to see more alignment across our evaluation systems. We also hope that by incorporating a 360 survey for our staff, or specifically for our principals, that we'd be able to provide them with more information about their practice. So in doing that, we could implement a survey and give them more feedback that they could use to improve their practice. Next, we also hope that it would provide additional evidence that would support other evaluation components. So in essence, it would strengthen our evaluation process by providing information that could be triangulated by other evaluation components. And then by also including a stakeholder survey, we could improve rating accuracy in hopes that we could better align school leader evaluation outcomes to the professional development offerings that we had. That would allow principals to have better access to the learning tools that they needed to improve their practice. Next slide, please. So as we began exploring whether or not to implement a 360 tool, we wanted to consider a few things with respect to the tools that we looked at. We wanted to ensure that the survey tools that we chose would be easy to implement within our district. We have several schools with multiple administrators who may be responsible for different groups of teachers, and so we wanted to ensure that any tool that we implemented could accommodate those different scenarios at the various schools that we had. We also, as Brian mentioned, wanted to ensure confidentiality because we were hearing from our stakeholders that there could be some issues of trust and fear of retaliation, and so we wanted to make sure that any tool that we considered can ensure the anonymity of our stakeholders. Also, our district has quite a few survey tools in place, and so various schools have any number of surveys that they could be taking at any given time, and we wanted to ensure that our users would not experience survey fatigue. So some of the things that we considered as a district is whether or not some of the tools may have other components that could easily be utilized as an extension of a survey. So we were looking at surveys that we might have been using for other purposes that could also be used for feedback about school leaders' practice. And lastly, we wanted to ensure that any survey that we would select could be used for other role groups in our district in addition to school leaders. So some of the other groups that we were considering were folks who are part of our district leadership or cabinet level positions, as well as our central office roles. So those would be non-certified roles or roles that weren't necessarily in our schools, for instance, like our chief of HR, for whom the survey could also be used. Again, we wanted to ensure alignment, and we also wanted to ensure that our school-based staff were not the only ones for whom we were requiring this level of accountability for. Next slide. As we began the steps of this process, we are currently still in the early stages, but some of the things or some of the steps that we thought were important as we considered implementation was communication. The initial step of this process was to educate our leadership and our school leaders, and REL was instrumental in assisting us in becoming more educated about the benefits and the impact of using a stakeholder engagement survey. And so in order to achieve those goals, they around rating accuracy and using the evaluation results to plan for PD, they were able to meet with our stakeholders to provide an overview of what research was available about this tool, about these tools, and about the specific tools that we might want to explore as a district. REL was also helpful in sharing communication with our stakeholders, and were able to come out to our district and present to both of those role groups. The other step of the process that we think is important in this work is engagement. And I think Brian spoke to that earlier about the importance of getting buy-in and building trust. And so as a part of that process, one of the things that our district is doing is forming an advisory committee who can assist us in selecting a tool and thinking about how we incorporate that tool into the evaluation and growth process. We also plan to engage our stakeholders in the refinement of our business rules, which will determine how the tool results get incorporated. Again, we believe this is an important part of building the trust and buy-in amongst all of our stakeholders who will eventually participate in this process. Lastly, we think a vital step of the process is training. Once we've identified a tool, we are planning to ensure that all stakeholders are trained on using the process, but before we attach any high stakes, we want to get their feedback about their participation in using the tool, as well as understand we want to get their feedback about how we use that tool and use it in a pilot that doesn't attach any stakes to it. So I'll talk more about the pilot as we move to the next slide. Our intent is to roll the tool out, again, without attaching any stakes to it, in a two-phase pilot, which would first begin with our cabinet level staff, who will be, again, using the tool as a part of a test cycle and be able to provide us with feedback about their use with the tool before we roll that tool out for attaching stakes, perhaps in the following year if we aren't able to identify any kinks or problems with the tool. And then we would repeat that same test cycle with another group of stakeholders who would be our school leaders. And we think that this helps to reinforce trust by letting school leaders and others in our district know that our leadership believes and values this type of feedback in their own evaluation process before including the tool in others' evaluation processes. In closing, I would say that I hope that this presentation provides an overview of the process as used in our district. This is by no means the only way to use or to implement the tool. If I could outline some key takeaways, I would say that one of the processes, or one of the steps in the processes that we think is important, is to include and engage the stakeholders. And one way could be in the selection of the tool or examining how to include the results and the outcomes. But certainly there are other ways to include and engage stakeholders. But again, that is important in building trust and establishing buy-in. I think another takeaway would be to consider the individual school and district needs related to trust and anonymity or other culture and climate issues that might be present in your school or district before deciding to implement such a tool. And then lastly, I think that another important facet of including such a tool is to not attach any high stakes to the survey outcomes in the initial year until you understand how the tool is going to perform or work in your individual district. And so I think at this point, I will turn it back over to Brian.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. And now I think we are ready to take questions. We have some. Before we do that, we want to point out that we've also created an infographic on teacher feedback and school leader evaluations. You can find it. There's a LinkedIn link here, but it shouldn't be too hard to find if you go to the REL Mid-Atlantic website. So you have a Q&A tab where you can submit questions, and I hope you have some for us. You might indicate whether they are most appropriately addressed by one of us REL researchers or by Alyssa from the district perspective, or we can try to figure that out ourselves. So go ahead and send them in, and we will try to see how many of those we can respond to in our last 18 minutes or so. I will start with one. It looks like we've got one here that we can start with. Is it necessary for all teachers in a school building to complete the survey, or can only a subset of teachers participate? That's a great question, and it's one that, of course, is relevant to the extent of burden that the survey creates. The additional, it does require some time of teachers. And that's an issue that, as Alyssa pointed out, is something that any district needs to consider. The different survey providers provide some variation in their guidance about this. The key point, I think, though, is that it's important to get a high response rate. In some instances, particularly in large schools, it may not be necessary to ask all teachers to complete the survey, and it could be fine to do a sample of teachers. But the important thing is that if you sample the teachers, you still want to get all of the ones who are sampled to respond, because otherwise the concern would be that if you get low response rates, then the people who respond might not be representative of all the teachers as a whole. It's entirely possible that the respondents could be either teachers who are particularly happy with the leadership or perhaps particularly unhappy with the leadership. So sampling can be a possibility in larger schools in particular, but whether you're going to survey all the teachers or whether you're going to sample, either way it's important to make sure you get a high response rate. The valid in particular, it's worth noting, allows a variation to have a couple of different forms so that you can split up the questions. You can ask all the teachers to respond to a survey, but you reduce the burden by splitting the questions in half and getting getting teachers to respond to one half of the survey or the other. So that's another way to try to reduce the burden. And again, in that instance, as in the other cases, it's important to try to get a high response rate. And it looks like we have one for Brittney next.
Thanks, Brian. An attendee asked where they could find more information regarding the VALED and Tripod surveys. They are commercial products. Both the VALED and Tripod surveys are commercial products. On our presentation, we have citations regarding some of the evidence around the instruments, and then both of those companies, or more I should say providers, can be contacted to find out more information regarding the instruments themselves. They have sample items on their websites, but if you contact the individual provider, they can provide more specific information regarding the items in the survey and different ways to apply the survey to your specific needs within your school or district. I hope that answers that question. And then it looks like the next question is for Alyssa.
Yes, thanks, Brittney. The first question I have is, what survey tool is used by Pittsburgh? And so currently, Pittsburgh is in the early phase of determining which tool we'll use. We are engaging our stakeholders around the selection of the tool. We'd like a few vendors to come and present to our stakeholders in order that they might provide us some insight on which tool might work best in their buildings. And that's kind of related to the second question. The next question is, are there suggestions of how to engage principals in the process of selecting and adopting the tool? So one of the things that we are doing is forming advisory groups. So we will get suggestions from principals about members that they would like to participate as members of a committee. We currently have networks, so we are asking for volunteers from each of the 5 networks to sit on the advisory committee, and they will, in addition to all principals, so the advisory committee as well as the full compilation of principals will be invited to the presentations from the different vendors and have an opportunity to provide feedback and share their feedback with the advisory committee. And so our thinking is that the advisory committee will be the voice for the principal cadre and be able to weigh in on which tools to adopt and how to include the results from those tools in the evaluation results.
Thanks, Alyssa. It looks like our next question is one that could be, probably any of us could take a crack at. How can the data from these instruments benefit districts? And I think there are a variety of benefits that they can provide. I think the most important thing is helping districts to really be able to identify the principals who are doing a great job and distinguish them from the principals who may need a lot more help. As I mentioned earlier, principals vary in their effectiveness, just as professionals in any field do. And it's useful to be able to provide a measure that gives them feedback in how they vary, and feedback that may be able to help them improve their performance. So I would say that's the first and most important benefit to districts from that they might be able to get from incorporating teacher feedback in the principal evaluation process. Alyssa, would you like to add anything to that?
I agree, Brian. Also, I know for our district, we were really hoping to be able to more accurately identify professional development offerings that could help principals. And so we were feeling that because we weren't necessarily getting the most accurate information about their practice, that we weren't able to offer them the support that they would need to improve their practice. So one of the things that we're hoping will come as a result of this is that we will be able to more narrowly identify the types of support that principals need.
Great. Then we also have a question that probably reflects the fact that we have a lot of researchers on the call. How can districts establish the reliability and validity of a survey during a pilot study? That's an excellent question. And frankly, I think that's going to depend in significant part on how widely you can administer the pilot survey and the resources you've got available to for that. One of the advantages of using a survey like Valid or Tripod is that most of that work has already been done in terms of validity and reliability, so you have a tested instrument. It is, of course, possible to create your own instrument, and then it would be more important to do the statistical analysis on validity and reliability. And I think there are a variety of standard approaches you could take to that when you get feedback from a reasonable number of teachers and principals. This would, of course, be much harder to do in a very small district. But I think that there should be, in any case, there are various opportunities to test reliability with the teacher-level responses, getting responses from individual teachers across multiple principals. And with respect to validity, one of the interesting things that I think is worth doing and that should be relatively easy for any district to do would involve essentially correlating the results from the teacher survey with other measures you might have of principal performance, whatever you're currently using with respect to a supervisor's judgment about the performance of individual principals. You'd expect those things to be at least related statistically. You wouldn't expect them to be exactly the same. And if they were going to be exactly the same, you wouldn't need multiple measures. But they ought to be at least correlated. Let's see. Now it looks like we have another one for Alyssa. Dialogue seems key. What is some feedback that you've heard during the process in Pittsburgh?
Yes. So I don't want to lead everyone to think that principals are necessarily all on board with this. We realize we still have a lot of engagement and dialogue to be had with principals. I think some of the feedback that we have gotten are some concerns about teachers who are in need of some additional support. Brian alluded to this, who may be retaliatory in their feedback because they may not like the type of support or accountability that principals are giving to them. So I think there was some great concern about that. There was also some concern about survey fatigue. Principals indicated that they currently have a lot of surveys going on in their building, and so one more survey could add some additional burden. So we did hear a lot of concern about that. So I think one of the things as a district that we are concerned about is wanting to do this right and wanting to make sure that we aren't putting additional undue burden on principals and schools. So we want to make sure that we are getting the feedback and getting input about the best way to incorporate this in a way that is going to benefit schools. We certainly aren't looking for additional things to put on principals. So we want to make sure that we're having ongoing dialogue. And as a result of that, hearing some of that pushback and feedback from principals are taking some additional time to implement this process. We initially wanted to do it during the 17-18 school year, but wanting to ensure that we take our time to do this right, we are pushing that process out a little bit more with our schools.
Thank you, Alyssa. Okay, I think looks like that covers just about all the questions we've got, so now we will. We have one more about the length of a pilot phase. How long of a pilot is a reasonable thing to do? I think that could probably depend on an individual district's circumstances. I think it would make sense in most instances to have a pilot for a year, as Pittsburgh is doing, to give people time to get used to this. I don't immediately see a need for it to be longer than that. But that should be presumably enough for principals to experience how this will actually look and how this will feel in terms of the kind of feedback they are getting. So I think that we've actually made it through all the questions, which is great since it's now about 4 minutes before the hour. So thank you all again for participating. This will conclude the webinar, and I want to thank you again to Alyssa for joining us on this and giving us a perspective from the field in Pittsburgh. Thank you all in the audience for your participation. We're hoping that you can take the last 3 minutes here to submit some feedback to the presentation team using the survey widget in the menu at the bottom of the event console. That's the one that's sort of the turquoise color on the far right, as you can see here in the slide. So we'd really like your feedback. We will use your responses to these survey questions to plan our future webinar events. On the next slide, we have contact information for today's presenters. Feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions for us. And we also have on the next slide a list of resources and relevant research for those interested in learning more. It's also worth mentioning, in addition to this bibliography here, which is a little tough to read quickly, but as was mentioned earlier, this will be publicly available in recording form shortly, and you can also send us questions about this. But it's also worth mentioning that our colleagues at one of the other regional labs at REL Northeast and Island are going to be doing a webinar on school leadership later this week. They are doing a webinar on building a pipeline of effective principals, costs, resources, challenges, and opportunities. That's going to be on Thursday the 16th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And to register for that and get more information about it, you can go to the website of REL Northeast and Islands. So as a reminder, the on-demand recording is going to be available soon. It will be accessible using the same link that was sent to you following your registration. The recording and a transcript will also be posted on the REL Mid-Atlantic website in the coming weeks. So once again, thank you for attending the webinar, and we hope to interact with you on a future one. Bye-bye.